Well, we have finally done it. We are now in Daniel chapter 6. So if you remember back when we started, we said Daniel's really divided into two parts. The first 6 chapters are 6 different stories. This is the last of those stories. And then the next 6 chapters are going to get into some very deep prophecy, end times type stuff. This chapter here, it's Daniel in the lion's den. Probably one of the most famous chapters in the entire Bible. I'm sure you guys already know the story, but it's worth going through anyway because it's really, really good. So we will go ahead and jump in here. Again, Daniel chapter 6, we'll start with verses 1 through 3. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So we see here this transition of power. If you remember last week, chapter 5, we saw the fall of the Babylonian Empire. The Medo-Persian Empire has come in. Babylon has fallen. Now the new empire takes effect. It is run by this King Darius. Daniel is going to be working for him. And in the beginning here, these first few verses, we see some of the logistics of the setup here. We see some of the hierarchy and how this works. We have the king who's over everything. And then apparently he has appointed underneath himself, logistically, 3 administrators. And then there are 120 satraps who report to the administrators who work for the king. And I don't know if they were evenly distributed or not, but this is an idea of what this might have looked like, this kind of hierarchy. Good thing for him to do because this is the empire that rules over the entire known world at the time. There is a lot of ground to cover. So King Darius goes ahead and sets all of this up. And as we read here in these first few verses, apparently our friend Daniel, he's one of those administrators. This is a big deal, right? So the legend of his support of the various kings before him must have been told to Darius when he comes in. Also, if we remember the end of chapter 5, he just got this purple robe put on him. He's been given the power of the 3rd highest person in the kingdom. And when the invaders come in, whatever their process was, they didn't murder him, but instead they put him in charge of a lot. So this was good for Daniel. Daniel apparently does very, very well initially with King Darius too, because it says right here that Darius was thinking about promoting him. And it kind of makes sense, right? Daniel doing a really good job. If we remember back in chapter 1, he was prepared literally by God to do this job. And then he has 39 years of experience working for Nebuchadnezzar after that. And so we put those two things together, and you can see this guy, very, very qualified to be an administrator in this kingdom. And so he did so good that the king says, well, really you might want to change our org chart from this to maybe something like this. That was his plan. Oh, goodness, I'm sorry. I do not have... There we go. The visuals all flowed out really nicely as I was explaining this. It's a shame I didn't get to see it, but anyway, so that's what the kingdom is going to look like, or this is Darius's plan to make it look like this. And that leads us to verses 4 through 5. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." So we see in these verses the administrators and the satraps conspired against Daniel. And why did they do this? Well, as you didn't see the org chart play out, the king was planning on making some changes. Daniel is this very powerful guy. The king is about to make him in charge probably of about everything. And so in a deeply political organization like this, There's some human nature that plays out. So this is probably a mix of things. There's probably some political jealousy. Usually your people in governmental structures, especially at the top level, they're interested in climbing that ladder, and there's always some jealousy among many of these types of people. Also, in that environment, we got to think, if Daniel is going to display tremendous competence, that's going to be provocational to everybody else, right? Because suddenly Daniel's doing this amazing job as an administrator. You line him up next to the other administrators, he doesn't make those other guys look so good. So probably that's going to upset everybody else because he's making them look bad. This would have made corruption more difficult. You got a guy like Daniel and he's in charge. You've got some other things going on you shouldn't have going on. It's going to be a lot harder for you to continue doing those things if suddenly Daniel becomes your boss, because he's not going to be doing any of that sort of thing. Add into that, Daniel is a Judean. He's a foreigner. He probably looks a little bit different. He probably still has some type of accent. He worships a different god. He's been immersed in this Babylonian culture for a really long time, but he is still very clearly different from everyone else because he has intentionally set himself apart from the corrupting forces of the world. Daniel has not embraced all of the things of the culture that he has been working in, and these other guys can certainly see that. So he's going to be very different from the other leaders within the organization. So the administrators and the satraps get together and they conspire, trying to find something to use against Daniel. But as we read, they're unable to actually find anything to charge him with. Daniel is just simply too competent, and his personal integrity is too good. He's not making major mistakes in the work that he's doing, and he's walking the straight and narrow because he's a follower of God. He doesn't have these deep veins of corruption or whatever that many would, because he believes he's reporting to a holy God, right? He's competent. He has integrity. They realize, we're not going to find any dirt on this guy no matter how long we keep digging. And so what they determined was Daniel's only vulnerability must lie with his devotion to his God. And on one hand, they're right, because if they're trying to find some wedge that they can put between the king and Daniel, this is going to be it, because they know Daniel's going to follow God above all else. So in a way, they're absolutely right about this. But on the other hand, it's really a bad move on their part, because what they're failing to take into account is that God is, well, God. Verses 6 through 9. So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, "May King Darius live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce a decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed." So King Darius put the decree in writing. So the administrators and the satraps get together, they formulate a plan, and they go to the king. And notice how their interaction with the king flows. They don't come right out and say what's on their mind. They start out with flattery, right? "May the king live forever." Flattery can be a very effective technique for many people. It tends to soften up the hearer if they're vulnerable to that, right? Because generally we want people to like us, and so when people start out saying nice things about us, inherently we're going to like that. It's going to make us more predisposed to what they have to say. And again, some people are more vulnerable to that than others. Saw a lot of that in my corporate days. That really annoys me, but some people really like it, especially some of these really powerful guys. And this might have worked with King Darius. So I think there's a lesson for us here if we pause. Beware of flattery, right? Beware of those who might flatter you, because there's a very good chance there's something following that they're going to try to use to manipulate you with. Proverbs 26:28, "A lying tongue hates those it hurts, and a flattering mouth works ruin." Proverbs 29:5, "Those who flatter their neighbors are spreading nets for their feet." Remember, the purpose of flattery is to manipulate. It's to get the flattery to become more open to whatever it is the flatterer wants to do. And so, very simple lesson to us: if somebody or a group of people approaches you and they start whatever it is that they have to say with flattery, beware, right? Be wary of that. So that's what these guys do. They start out talking to the king. They start out with flattery, and then they move on to a qualification, right? They're going to introduce this idea, hey, you need to pass this law that nobody can pray to anybody but you for a month. But they start out with flattery, and then they say this qualification: King, all of your government, your entire government has agreed that this rule needs to pass. And they specify all of this out. They said all of the administrators, all of the prefects, all of the satraps, all of the advisors, all of the governors all agree, King, that you need to do this. And we don't know all the details behind the other conversations that were going on behind the scene, but it's very clear that at least some of this statement is a lie. Bible said in verse 4, this was a conspiracy between the satraps and the administrators. Daniel's an administrator, and I'm sure he's not involved in this. So certainly the entire government is not in agreement that this is what should be done. It doesn't mention anything in the Bible about the prefects, the advisors, or the governors being involved in the conversation at all. It might be that none of them have even talked about this. Some of them could have been brought into it, we don't know, but probably not all of them. So here's our next lesson. Yes, beware of flattery, but also beware of the unimpeachable majority. King, everybody in your government says this is something that needs to happen. That's just simply not true. In all fairness, in this situation, it might have been a majority, but saying everybody is aligned on this, that's just manipulation going on here. It's false. This is a common tactic. It's not only within the pages of Daniel chapter 6. People manipulate this way today, just like they did with flattery back then. This is very common. You hear this, right? Everybody is saying that this particular thing needs to change, or that this thing is a problem. All credible scientists agree, right? Science is a consensus that this particular thing is true. A whole bunch of people came to me and they're very concerned about this thing that's going on. Really? A bunch? How many is a bunch? One person? Two? It's just you? Beware of the unimpeachable majority, right? The point of view, think about this from the point of view of the hearer. Somebody comes to them and says, oh, everybody is asking for this particular thing. So from the point of view of the hearer, you'd naturally say, well, if everybody is wanting that, then maybe that's the right thing to do. So maybe a whole bunch of people are really upset about a particular thing. Maybe. So the natural response of the hearer is going to be, well, I need to take this into consideration. But generally, when somebody appeals to the unimpeachable majority, it's not really a majority. Right? It's something that that person probably believes they've allowed their emotions to amplify the source. But generally, if somebody comes to you that way, ask for names. Really? A lot of people came to you? Who? Well, they don't want to be named. Well, then don't worry about it. Right? If you have one person who wants to remain anonymous, fine, listen to that. But if it's a whole bunch of people that will not be named, sorry, let that go, right? Beware of flattery. Beware of the unimpeachable majority if you hear these things. And if those two are together, somebody starts out asking you for something, they start out with flattery and then move to the unimpeachable majority, be very, very skeptical. All right, so that's how all of this starts out. And then they say, hey, you need to pass this law. Everybody's in favor of it, you wonderful king. You need to pass this law where nobody can pray to anyone but you for a month. Verse 9, the king puts this into law. And it's important that it points out here, too, that it is part of the Medo-Persian custom that laws, once something becomes a law, it is irrevocable. It's not something that they can back down from later. Verses 10 through 11. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying, asking God for help. All right, so King Darius makes this decree. Can't pray to anybody but me for a month. Daniel heard about this, and what does he do? Daniel prays openly to God. And notice how it says he's praying 3 times daily, and he is facing Jerusalem while he is doing this. If you remember back during the summer when we worked through our series on prayer, we talked about this history of why facing Jerusalem, and we put like azimuths on the wall here. We talked through why he might have been facing toward Jerusalem. I don't think we touched on the why 3 times per day. We'll probably revisit those things during the midweek. He is praying 3 times per day. He is facing Jerusalem. But what he is praying for, that's relevant this morning for our discussion here. And it says he's praying for 2 things. Verse 10, he is praying a prayer of thanksgiving. And notice that it says he's praying these prayers of thanksgiving just as he had done before. This is not a new prayer in reaction to King Darius's new directive, right? He had been doing this. Things had been pretty good, and when they were good, he gave these prayers of thanks. And now trials have come, and he is still praying to God, still thanking him. There is an obvious lesson for us in there as well. He is praying these prayers of thanksgiving, but in verse 11, he's also asking God for help. Probably these are prayers for wisdom and protection. You could imagine in the middle of something like this, that would be probably something you'd include in your prayers as you're crying out to God. I'm going to be under a death sentence probably for doing this. Probably praying for wisdom and protection. I get it. It's also been suggested by some that maybe he's also praying for help for physical strength to continue executing his duties. You think about where chapter 6 is in the grand timeline of things. Daniel by now is more than 80 years old. He's been in captivity for 66 years. So he might indeed be praying, God, just give me the strength to be continuing in the face of all this. He must be very, very tired. But regardless of what he was praying for, notice this, Daniel makes absolutely no attempt to hide the fact that he is praying to God. Not going out and making a special spectacle of all of it. He's just continuing to do what he had done before, and he doesn't hide it. Verse 12. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. So the conspirators go to King Darius, and just like when they talked to him before, they're crafty in choosing their words specifically when they're speaking to him now. Notice how they word this whole interaction here. They don't start out with the accusation. They first ask the king about the law that they had previously talked him into passing. Right? They say, tell us, right? They're getting him to repeat it. They're getting him to actually say this. All right? So they first ask the king about this law, and then the king repeats it, or they repeat it and say, hey, you know, that law, didn't you just sign something like that into law recently? And the king confirms it, and he says, yes, and the decree stands. And the king echoes what had been brought up back in verse 8, and that is, apparently, in the Medo-Persian Empire, the king did not have unlimited power to do whatever he wanted to do. This is very different from the power that Nebuchadnezzar had under the Babylonian customs and rules. The king could make law, but he did not have the power to repeal that law. Verses 13 through 16, then they said to the king, Daniel, who was one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. So the conspirators spring their trap. They just got Darius to reiterate the law, and they even got him to tell them or to remind them that, yeah, this law can't be changed. And then they mentioned to him, well, oh gosh, that guy Daniel, your favorite administrator, he's in violation of that law. And notice they say he still prays 3 times per day. Like they have set this whole thing up. They've been watching him. And notice what they say too. There's more craftiness here. They refer to Daniel as Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah. That statement, that's a true statement, and that's fine, but probably the more natural way to bring him up in this particular context would have been that administrator Belteshazzar, that would have been how to bring him up. Not Daniel, but the administrator Belteshazzar, because that's the name the king probably would have been calling him, right? That's the role that he has been serving in the government. Would make sense. That's how you would refer to him, but they purposely instead use his Hebrew name, and they do this to discredit him and to belittle him, and they refer to him as an exile from another land instead of giving him the respect that he was due for the office that he was in. And remember, Daniel is the boss of many of these guys and about to become the boss of all of them. And still, this is how they're referring to him. It's just really a deliberate smear on behalf of the conspirators, and then they state the accusation. Right? They say, hey, he's still praying 3 times a day. And listen, their accusation, this is partly true, but it's a truth that also includes some lies. Verse 13, they said, he pays no attention to you or your laws. And of course, we know this is absolutely not true. We know this because of the reaction from Darius. Very clearly, King Darius and Daniel had a good relationship. And so if Daniel was just all blowing off the king all the time and didn't ever pay any attention to him or his laws, very clearly, Darius wouldn't be putting him in charge of everything. Very clearly, Daniel pays a lot of attention to the king and a lot of attention to his laws, but it is this one law that is just not possible for him to follow. So again, this whole thing, this whole speech, every word that these conspirators have chosen is just designed to get the king angry. I don't know, this guy doesn't care about you at all. Your authority means nothing to him. And it's not true, what they said, but then they move on to what is true, and that is that Daniel is in violation of this law. He is praying 3 times per day to a god other than the king, and that apparently this month is illegal. So they're telling the truth about what he is doing, but they embellish the story with lies about why he is doing it. And I think it's just to inflame the situation even more. So they finish the accusation, and King Darius becomes very upset. He knows what these guys are up to, right? He knows that this whole thing is just maneuvering, and he's not angry like Nebuchadnezzar would have been angry. How dare someone not respect my authority? He's angry because he's just figured out that he's been outmaneuvered here, and he's going to have to eliminate this guy that he cares about a lot. He still really likes Daniel. These guys they've got him over a barrel because he did pass that law, and he does not have the authority to repeal it. And we saw in verse 14 that regardless of the situation he's in, the king tries to help out Daniel anyway. But then the conspirators call him out on it on verse 15. They remind him, hey, the law says you can't repeal these things. That has to go forward. And so in verse 16, King Darius orders Daniel to be thrown into the lion's den. And he said, as Daniel went in, may your God, whom you serve, continually rescue you. And this appears to be genuine, right? I think we'll talk about that more in the midweek, comparing this to when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego got thrown into the furnace. We don't know if King Darius knew about that story or not. Right? Different empire, right? So all of the stories from long ago, he may not have been in possession of. He may not have known, or he may have known. The Bible doesn't really say. If he knew about what happened with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, then verse 16, we get why he's saying that, right? He's saying, man, I hope that your God will rescue you the same way he rescued Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from that fiery furnace. Or maybe he has no idea that happened, and he's just simply saying, that God whom you serve, that I have seen, that God make you effective in whatever you do. May that God deliver you through this. We don't know, but it's a very wonderful contrast with the taunting that Nebuchadnezzar gave to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It is what God can save you now. as he was throwing those men into the fiery furnace. Verses 17 and 18, a stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returns to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. So Daniel gets thrown into the lion's den, and then they roll this stone to close off the mouth of the den, and they put a seal on it. And logistically, we don't know for sure, but based on the wording that's here, it's likely that there's two openings to the lion's den. Again, this is speculation, but probably there was an opening in the front, like a big one, and then another opening on the top. And you can kind of look down through the one on the top, but Daniel couldn't really get out that way. So when they threw him in, they probably threw him in through the front and then closed it off with this giant stone so that neither Daniel nor the lions could get back out. And that stone that was blocking the main entrance, we said it was sealed, and that's not sealed like locked into place. This stone was heavy enough on its own, it probably wasn't going anywhere. This was more like a seal of authentication. So with a signet ring, like in wax, most likely. So the thing gets sealed. It's done with the signet ring of the king and the nobles. And the whole point of this would be these guys could go about their business. They could leave the room or wherever this thing was. They could go somewhere else. And if anybody came back, you could verify that it hadn't been tampered with. Nobody had done anything to let this guy out. It would have proved that this law was carried out. But also, it would serve another purpose too. We got to think when these guys go on and go about their important business elsewhere, somebody else can come in the room. They're going to hear some guy screaming from inside the lion's den. Their natural reaction, we got to get this person out. But if they see that it's been sealed and they see the signet rings from the king and the nobles, they realize they are not authorized to be able to do something like that. So they know they would need to leave that thing in place. So Daniel's tossed into the lion's den. It gets sealed up. The king's hand was forced, but he followed the law like he had to do. And he was apparently pretty torn up about it, right? The Bible said he didn't eat or sleep or enjoy any entertainment. And it really seems, from this part of the story, like contrasting him with Nebuchadnezzar, King Darius sounds like he might be a stand-up guy. We're going to see that God is indeed going to take care of Daniel, though. Verses 19 through 22. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Daniel answered, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done anything wrong before you, your majesty." So as soon as it's the next day, which I guess is the first legal time that the king can intervene, King Darius gets up and he runs to the lion's den. He calls out to Daniel to see if he's okay, and notice the wording that he uses. He refers to Daniel as servant of the living God, and he asks him if his God has kept him from being eaten. Daniel replies, he pays the customary respect to the king, "May the king live forever." And then he says that God sent his angel to deal with the lions. And if you remember back in chapter 3, when we worked through the fiery furnace and we have those guys being protected in there, and there was the angel of the Lord in there with them, we said it's most likely that when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in that fiery furnace, that was probably Jesus who was in there with them. And so it is likely here too, although I would say with a much lower confidence interval, that it was Jesus himself who showed up, and this time closing the mouths of the lions. And Daniel says that God did this because he was innocent in God's eyes, and he had never done anything wrong before the king either. And this statement really gave me pause, because there's no way that can be completely true. If you've been following along with our Bible in a Year reading plan, Job has said some similar things about being completely blameless. And I spent a lot of time trying to understand what these guys were really saying when they said these things. If I can get to the bottom of that, we're going to focus heavily on that in the midweek. But maybe not. This is a very interesting question. How can he say something like that? But certainly by comparison, he doesn't do a lot of things wrong, but there's no way he's completely blameless. Anyway, verse 23, The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. Daniel trusted in God. Here's an interesting thought. It's a recurring theme in Daniel, sort of this contrast between God and the false gods. False gods are completely impotent, but God can do amazing things. That's what we keep seeing again and again in Daniel. And so if you think about how chapter 6 plays out, it's really the same lesson yet again. For 30 days, Darius has tried to step into the role of God, right? He's decreed that nobody could worship any god but him. But then during this time period, this problem happens. He gets outmaneuvered by some of his men, and he doesn't want Daniel to be killed, but he is absolutely powerless to solve this issue. He is king. He is a very powerful man, but there is a limit to his power. He can't save Daniel, but God shows that he can. And so we really have the same classic Daniel lesson playing out here in chapter 6, as has played out in previous chapters. Verse 24, at the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. So now the tables turn. King Darius was powerless to reverse the law that he had made, but he was not powerless. Now, I don't know what the conspirators were thinking when they did this. I'm not sure why they assumed there would be no consequences for what they've done. I don't know, maybe they just thought, well, he can't kill all of us. I don't know, but regardless, with Daniel safe, King Darius has the conspirators and their families thrown into the den. And we see that whatever power God used to close the mouths of those lions, that had been removed. Everybody was tossed in through that hole on the top of the lion's den. They were eaten before they even hit the floor. So as we read through this, personally, I kind of go from being very enthusiastic about, great, justice is going to be served, and then just kind of get sick to my stomach because this is just brutal. Verses 25 through 28. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Remember verse 28 when you read something that says Darius and Cyrus are the same guy? Verse 28 again, Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So all this happens. King Darius makes this pronouncement, and it's a very, very good one. He gives this requirement for everybody to fear and reverence God, and he explains why. He says, he gives this list. His list is very, very good. He has clearly been paying attention to what has been going on. He says, God is the living God. He endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and saves, performs signs and wonders. He rescued Daniel. And so it's kind of similar to King Nebuchadnezzar in this respect, right? Both of these guys, we see them get confronted with the power of God, and then both of them respond with these pretty amazing pronouncements. Nebuchadnezzar, this happened more than once. Nebuchadnezzar said some amazingly profound things after he'd seen God's work firsthand. But while we see that didn't mean too much long-term for Nebuchadnezzar, he kept going back to his old ways. I have a little more hope for King Darius. He seemed to have his act together a whole lot more than Nebuchadnezzar. It would not surprise me at all if we see him in heaven one day. That'd be pretty cool. We'll have to see. Unfortunately, this is really the last that we hear of him in the Bible. King Darius is going to show up again in chapter 9 of Daniel, but it's really just a mention. It's just there as a reference point. There's two other mentions of a King Darius elsewhere in the Bible, but these are probably two other kings who happen to have the same name. So who knows what fate befell this man. But again, I've got some high hopes for him because he seemed to have his head screwed on a whole lot better than Nebuchadnezzar. All right, so we'll wrap this up. What do we take away from all of this? Well, It's classic Daniel here. God is the one who is in charge. God has appointed kings to rule, but once again we see that ultimately it's God who calls the shots. Right? The kings have leeway to do what they want to some extent, but when they go too far, God doesn't let his plans be foiled. God had a plan for Daniel, and it didn't matter what the king or the conspirators did, even to the point of having him thrown into a den full of hungry lions. You think about this, in this story, we have all of the satraps, 120 of them, and all of the administrators less one, that'll be Daniel, so there's 2 administrators. 122 of these guys, they make this plan to kill off Daniel. And you have the king, he didn't want to go along with it, but he got tricked into doing so when he had to. And so we see that, add all that together, we have the 123 most powerful men in the world at the time, aside from Daniel. They were of one mind that Daniel should be eaten by lions. There was not a single man who was helping Daniel. The king wanted to, but he couldn't. And Daniel gets thrown into the lion's den, and God shuts the mouths of the lions because his plans didn't involve Daniel getting eaten that day. The 123 most powerful men in the world all conspire to have the same very simple thing accomplished, and because it conflicts with what God wants, it doesn't happen. Now here's the point. Most people in the world, most Christians, go through lives worried about kings and administrators and satraps. And we worry about them to the point that we forget what God is trying to teach us through the book of Daniel. Yeah, those guys are in charge. Yes, they have some worldly power, but their power does not exceed God's power. I would go so far as to say, you can step back and look at chapters 1 through 6 of Daniel, and I would say we are really in a situation that is very much like the situation that Daniel was in. I mean, none of us got carried away into some distant land, but the Bible tells us if you are born again, your citizenship is not the United States. Your citizenship is in heaven. The Bible says as children of God, we are strangers here. We are exiles in this wicked, wicked land. And we have a government and we have a culture that is largely hostile to people like us, and I hope that's changing. It might change back the other way, who knows? But really, right now, our situation is not all that different than Daniel's. Daniel got carried far away from his home. We right now are living far away from our true heavenly home as well. And look, Daniel knew that the exile that he was experiencing was temporary. Because Jeremiah had prophesied this, right? Jeremiah had said Judah is going to be exiled for a period of 70 years. Daniel would have known that. Daniel was in exile. And I'm sure that situation was unpleasant for him, yes. But he knew the prophecy. He would have known that this problem of being in this strange, wicked land was only a temporary thing. Judah was going to go home. It was just a matter of time. He just had to stay strong. So for us today, we are citizens of heaven. We Christians are living as exiles here on this earth. The Bible tells us that for us too, this exile is just a temporary thing. Jesus has promised to come back for us. Unlike Daniel's situation, we can't look at the calendar and nail down exactly when this homecoming prophecy is going to come true, but we can bank on the fact that it will. So in the face of this, really being in the same situation that Daniel is in, we need to live like Daniel was living during the time that he was in the same situation that we are. We need to be like Daniel, not allowing ourselves to become polluted by the things of the world like we saw in chapter 1. We need to be like Daniel and allow God to equip us so that we can show our value, empowered by God, makes us worth 10 times that of a worldly person, just like Daniel did. We need to be like Daniel, focusing only on God in the middle of a world that is absolutely obsessed with gods and idols. We need to keep ourselves separated from all of that and not hide who we serve. When the world says we can't worship God or pray to him like we're supposed to, we need to be like Daniel and not worry about the noise of the world. Maintain our integrity. We need to continue to serve the king as best we can and let God be the one to keep the mouths of the lions shut. Because just as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said back in chapter 3, God's going to deliver us from the king. It's just a question of whether he'll deliver us from death or deliver us in death. But either way, God is still the one who's in charge. His plans are still the ones who are being executed. We need to make sure we are following him 100% with integrity, just like Daniel did. Just like with Daniel, our praise for him should never leave our lips. Would you bow with me in prayer? Dear Lord, we thank you so very much for sharing this book with us. We thank you for what you put your servant Daniel through and your people through. We thank you to see this prophecy fulfilled. We thank you to see you preserving the details of what happened during this period of exile. And we thank you how you arranged all of these events so you could prove again and again this contrast between you and the false gods of the world. We ask that you would please give us wisdom from the things we have talked about. And God, as we often pray, if I have made any mistakes in what I have taught in these first chapters of the book, that you would bring those mistakes to light so we would not be led astray. But whatever we have worked through that's true and in accordance with your word, Lord, give us wisdom from these things. Give us discernment and understanding and knowledge. Please make us better sons and daughters to you as a result. Father, we just pray for our country, our nation, as there is this inauguration that is right around the corner, and we have a very divided land, and we just pray, Lord, for a peaceful transfer of power. We pray that you would be honored and glorified, and that somehow whatever you have decided is going to transpire, that it will turn people to you, it will turn hearts and minds to you. God, we ask that you would let your will be done here, and if it's within your will, we would ask that for the sake of those here who love you and are called according to your purpose, that you would swing the pendulum back the other way, that we as a nation might return to being one nation under you. Father, we love you so very much. We thank you for loving us first. We ask you please get us home safely, bring us back together again soon to worship you again. We love you and pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.